Coronavirus, perhaps the biggest crisis our country has faced for a generation. What do you make of the way the government has handled things so far?
Just before answering that, and on the back of Rosanna's interview, I just think we should note the enormous debt of gratitude we owe to our NHS frontline staff who've been absolutely extraordinary, to everyone working in the NHS and to the carers, paid and unpaid, who are bearing the brunt of this crisis. So I just wanted to say I think the entire nation is looking at them and saying this is the best of what we have to offer as a country, and we should be very grateful to them. Look, this is an unprecedented challenge, and I don't want to be in a position of offering criticism of the government. I think they'll be working as hard as they possibly can. They're doing everything they can. They will be mobilising the entire resources of government. I think, and I offer this not as a criticism, but as constructive advice, in my view, it is all about getting to mass testing as fast as possible, because we have to know who has the disease and who has had the disease in order to get the lockdown eased and get people back to work and get some semblance of normality back into our daily lives. So I think the only thing I would say is, for me, this is right from the very beginning. It's been about, of course, organising the NHS to respond to this crisis, but the issue of testing, both the PCR test to say who has the disease and the antibody test to say who has had it and who therefore may be immune to it, these are the absolutely crucial things, I think.
It's interesting, isn't it, you say that that could be one route out of the lockdown, because obviously people have been talking about a potential vaccine, but do you think that if this mass testing is rolled out, not just to NHS staff but to ordinary people as well, that could be the more realistic way of easing the measures?
Well, I think it's the only way of easing the measures, ultimately, because, look, obviously the NHS frontline staff come first in testing, but what is the conundrum of the coronavirus crisis? The conundrum, the dilemma, if you like, is that only a small number of people are actually, in the end, going to have a life-threatening version of it. But a small percentage of a very large number is still a large number. And that's why it's absolutely right that we're taking the measures of social distancing and the lockdown. But in the end, the vast majority of the population will be capable of going back to work and will either have had the disease and are immune, or have had a milder version of the disease, or won't get it at all. But the problem is, unless you know who's had it or who has it, and those that don't, then it's very hard to see how you return to normal life, because your risk, obviously, is as you start to ease the lockdown, how do you then deal with any resurgence of the disease? And this, of course, is what they're now dealing with in China and South Korea and elsewhere. But unless you have that testing capability that you can apply at scale, and by the way, when I say mass testing, I mean, I actually think you'll need to get to the point where you've got the capability, and I assume we're preparing for this now, of testing literally a very large proportion of the entire population. And you may have to do those tests 2 or 3 different times, because you need all the time to be able to track what's happening with the disease, to learn where, for example, there may be a surge or a hotspot of it, and take immediate action.
What kind of percentage of the population are you talking about?
Well, I think you could be talking about virtually everybody. I mean, the problem with the coronavirus is that it's obviously highly contagious, and although it's true that some people will suffer no symptoms at all, I mean, if you look at the studies coming out of Italy, China, Iceland, Korea, Germany, large numbers of people are what they call asymptomatic. In other words, they don't experience any symptoms. The majority of people who get it will get it with a reasonably mild version. But unfortunately, there's a minority who get it severely, and if you get it severely, then it's obviously life-threatening, and you then impose an enormous strain on your healthcare system to deal with it. And that's why it's completely right, as the government's doing, and Michael Gove was explaining, you've got to close things down in order to flatten the curve, get on top of the disease. But then as you ease from that, how are you going to ease from it unless you have a very clear understanding of who's got it and who doesn't? And that's why I think you will find that round the world, and this is, by the way, another reason why it's so sad you don't have greater global coordination on this, you'll need to have the capability with the tests, which, as I say, are not just for the people who have it, but for those who have had it, right, and therefore will be immune to it, at least for this cycle. You're going to have that capability.
Now, You were saying there that most people may just experience mild symptoms of the virus. One of those people who appears to be experiencing mild symptoms is Boris Johnson, testing positive for COVID-19. He's now leading the government's response in isolation from his Downing Street flat. As someone who was a Prime Minister for a decade, do you think it's feasible to run the country effectively from your living room?
Well, you can do. I mean, look, we've got the technology to be able to link people up. I mean, because my institute is working with countries around the world, and we've repurposed the entire institute for our teams that are in country to work with governments there. So I'm having virtual conversations, online conversations with people the entire time. Now, it's perfectly possible to do that. It depends how ill he is. But and again, I offer this not as criticism, because I really think everybody in government will be doing everything they possibly can. But I think what you find in these situations, I went through a much, much milder thing with foot and mouth disease, and my institute also worked throughout the Ebola crisis in West Africa. It is always around logistics and procurement. What you find in these situations is that you get bottlenecks, not about what you think you should do, because you can usually work that out, but how you do it, how you source equipment, how you get supplies, how you make systems move fast. And the only thing I would say on that, and it's really, the Prime Minister is perfectly able to direct this, provided his health has not deteriorated, but it's really about how you put the most capable people in charge of those elements of logistics and procurement. And I think the other thing we should be doing right now, by the way, is putting everything we can behind technology and innovation. There will be 1,000 things that technology can help us with, particularly when we need to get the data as to who's had it and who hasn't had it. How, for example, when we start to get back to work and you're trying to trace people, when you may get an outbreak, how you manage to trace all the people they've had contact with. I think there's a mobilization of the private sector alongside the public sector here that is important. And as I say, I offer this just from my own experience dealing with these things. You sometimes find that the best people on this are not to be found in the public sector, but in the private sector. For example, people who do procurement and logistics, that's what they do for a living every single day. I think mobilizing all that effort is also going to be important. And one other thing we shouldn't forget, this is a global crisis. And by the way, if any country in this crisis, and some of the poorest countries of the world where we're trying to help at the moment, and whose healthcare systems will be completely overwhelmed by this disease, if any country in the world is not over this disease, then all countries are at risk. I mean, this is the classic situation in which a global pandemic means if you don't have global coordination and global solutions, then everyone is affected.
I want to talk a little bit about that point that you make. It is, of course, a global crisis. Every country potentially could be affected here. How concerned are you about what coronavirus would mean to countries, for example, in Africa?
Right, so my institute's got partnerships with roughly 15, 16 different governments in Africa, including the largest countries there. You know, I'm seeing firsthand from the conversations I'm having with presidents and with others in the World Health Organization, you know, we've got a huge challenge, I mean, an unprecedented challenge. But these are healthcare systems that are already quite weak, government systems that aren't always as effective as they need to be. They've got a massive shortage of equipment, ventilators, protective clothing, masks, testing, of course. And in the end, if these countries, and they're just at the beginning of the curve now, if these countries aren't helped at this stage, then it's going to slow down the ability of the world as a whole to get over this crisis. And I still think, you know, around global coordination, I don't quite understand why there aren't streams of work going on where scientists are coming together to make sure that we develop the vaccine as swiftly as possible. Industries are being brought together across the globe so that when this vaccine is found and manufactured, you're able to distribute a vast amount of it and distribute it fairly. Why, for example, we know that ventilators and respiratory equipment is going to be extremely important. We know this may last for a year. You know, what is the global mechanisms pulling all this together and accelerating it? So it's very difficult for those countries in Africa and elsewhere than some of the poorest countries in the world, I mean, they are going to find this very, very tough. And it's worth, I know our priority will be everyone here at home, of course it will be. But, you know, we need to realize that in the end, if there's one part of the world that manages to get on top of this and another part of the world that can't, then in the end, we're all going to have to deal with it.
You talk about the need for a global response to coronavirus, but at the same time, what we've also seen, of course, is just how quickly it can spread across the world. Do you think it also shows some of the risks of globalisation too?
I don't look, globalisation. People want to travel. The migration's just a fact of modern life, and technology joins us up all the time. I don't think you're not going to stop that process unless you stop people travelling to different countries and all the trade and commerce that actually has made the world more prosperous. But what we do need to do, and the warning signs have been there for a long time. I mean, after Ebola, by the way, it was very clear. Ebola was limited, fortunately, to a small part of West Africa, and we were able to get on top of it and deal with it. But there were those at the time who said, you know, take this as a warning of what will happen if you get a global pandemic when, you know, you get a disease that spreads very easily. And the problem with COVID-19 is that it does spread very easily. So, you know, out of this, for sure, as well as the mechanisms of economic coordination to make sure that we reflate and re-energize the world economy, we should be taking steps that allow us to have the global framework and networks in place that if this happens again, and it will happen again, then we're better prepared to deal with it.
OK. Tony Blair, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.